Maybe just a few more coming in here. I'm just kidding, guys. Well, welcome this evening. Thank you so much for being here on a Friday night. We're very privileged and honored to have Dr. Stephen Willing here with us tonight. And I'm not going to do any more introduction for him. I'm going to let my friend John Murphy come speak in just a moment. I knew John when I was at Main Street and actually went to Israel and back with him. And I'm sure he has a lot of dirt on me after that trip. But he is the president of the Reasons to Believe chapter down in Austin on UT's campus. So you'll hear maybe from Dr. Willing or others that they have a speaker that comes in once a month and comes and speaks from an apologetics sense, typically on those topics. And I've been several times and have always enjoyed it. So if you're ever available on those Saturdays at 10 a.m., is that right? Down on UT's campus. What's the name of that church again?
Longhorn for Christ.
Longhorns for Christ, yes. It would be worth your time and your trip down there. So John manages all that and takes care of bringing in the guest speakers and all. So I'm going to let him come and speak and introduce Dr. Willing, and then we will transition from there.
So Jonathan just told you a lot of what I was going to say, actually. So actually, I'll let you hand those out to people. So we do meet once a month. And if you enjoy this kind of scholarly presentation, then that's exactly what we have once a month. We meet on the campus of U2. Hello, Morgans. And UT. Meet on the campus of UT. I do like UT. That's right. That was a Freudian slip. Anyway, so if you enjoy this, Dr. Willing's going to be speaking tomorrow at our RTB meeting, and on a different topic. He's going to be talking about how can people believe that? If you have the brochure there, it gives a little bit more detail. But this is an election year, and that's when we really wonder, how can people believe that? And so he's going to give us some scientific background on that, and I'm really looking forward to that, and would like to invite you all to attend and consider maybe coming to future presentations. But tonight, he's going to be talking about the top 10 myths of the sexual revolution. And so most of your writings, I believe, are on the behavioral sciences.
Yes.
And this is really right up his alley. Although he's officially retired, he does currently work in the neuroradiology department at the Children's Hospital in Alabama.
Yes.
And so again, he was telling me on the way up here that what he really loves is the reading and the writing and writing these papers. And so I'm very much looking forward to this talk, which he actually has in the form of a book on Amazon, if you want to get a paper copy of this. So at this time, let's turn it over to Dr. Willing.
Thank you. In 2017, Mark Regnerus, who is a Christian professor of sociology down at UT, he spoke at John's chapter last year. Mark Regnerus wrote in the Washington Post, and I quote, "It's not science that is secularizing Americans, it's sex." Now, I have an entire talk showing the evidence how beliefs and practices regarding sexuality are a driving force in people leaving the church, of people resisting Christianity, of young people drifting away. This is not that talk. But if you're convinced that it needs to be done, this is a talk that would explain the response to that situation. So, welcome. Over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to take a critical look at what I call the top 10 myths of the sexual revolution. Now, my primary aim here is to defend and uphold biblical sexuality to Christian believers of all ages. But it's also much more. My thesis is that all available evidence points to biblical sexuality as the optimal paradigm for human flourishing. So what it is, it's a natural law argument for the validity of scriptural teaching. So what's the sexual revolution anyway? Well, in its essence, it's the negation of God's design for marriage, sex, and children. Now, within the biblical paradigm, which is not just biblical, it's been reflected in almost all civilizations throughout history. We begin with marriage as the central institution. As you see in this diagram, sex takes place only within marriage, and children occur only as a result of sex within marriage. Now, fix this image in your mind. So marriage is at the top of the hierarchy. Now, this system seemed to work really well for thousands of years, and any deviation from this paradigm led to predictably bad consequences. But the actual expression sexual revolution was coined by Wilhelm Reich. Reich was a successor to Freud who ran his clinic in Vienna throughout the 1920s. In 1939, he immigrated to New York to join something called the New School for Social Research. Now, throughout his career, Reich advanced a number of very strange ideas, especially pertaining to human sexuality. Because of his extravagant health claims and disturbing connections with sexual abuse, Reich was pursued by the FDA and eventually died in prison. In his final years, he became increasingly delusional, if not overtly psychotic. Let me just summarize that saying none of Reich's ideas survive in modern mainstream science. But what we think of the sexual revolution really took off in the 1960s. And I'd argue that popular culture is a much more potent driving force than delusional Austrian psychotherapists. Its ultimate source, of course, is the father of lies. And at its heart, it is a rejection of Judeo-Christian morality. So let me elaborate on what that means. The sexual revolution severed traditional relationships between sex, marriage, and children. We can say it started with rupturing the tie between sex and children enabled by the pill in the 1960s. This was made possible by advancing technology and the Griswold decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. And what this meant was that people could engage in intercourse without worrying about the natural consequence, dramatically lowering the cost of sex, especially for women, but for men too. And if contraception did fail or was just too inconvenient, then you had abortion. Over 85% of abortions are among unmarried women. Next came the separation of sex from marriage. This was driven by pop culture as well as some shoddy scholarship, a la Freud, claiming that non-marital sex was healthy, normal, and free of any consequence. Finally, lastly, came the rupture between marriage and children. Now, out-of-wedlock birth is not the only cause. We can't overlook divorce, which rose rapidly in the late 20th century with a nationwide move towards no-fault divorce and increasing social acceptance. But remember, stage one is separating sex from children. There's another stage to that. There's another side to that coin. Technology has not only made it possible to have sex without children, it's made it possible to have children without sex. So there you see out there. So instead of marriage, sex is now at the top of the hierarchy. Some sexual relationships lead to or begin with marriage, but most do not. Children are usually within marriage, but often outside marriage, and thanks to the fertility industry, don't even require sex. Now, if any of you have read Brave New World, written 90 years ago, Huxley foretold all three stages. In his future dystopia, marriage is eliminated, and the break between sex and children is absolute. So in that context, you might find this quote from Huxley revealing, "For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom." So Huxley was pretty transparent about his motivations, but even in writing that book, he wasn't able to put lipstick on that pig. His imaginary future, this brave new world, was a dystopia. Now, some Christians are skeptical of science, but that's complicated. For reasons we don't need to get into, the relationship between science and faith can be complicated. So where are we? The sexual revolutionaries, if you listen to their proclamations, confidently claim that science is on their side. But not only is science not on their side, it increasingly points to the biblical view of human sexuality as the optimal pathway to human flourishing. Now, I'm going to present this as a top 10 myths, and this isn't a countdown. They're organized more by topic than priority, but I will offer my opinion as to which one is the worst, and it might not be the one you expect. So let's proceed to the first myth. Gender is a social construct. What does that mean? This is a claim that there are no intrinsic differences between men and women other than the physical ones, that everything pertaining to gender norms and roles is dictated by society. Now, this idea emerged during what we call second wave feminism. First wave feminism was a movement starting in the 1700s advancing the empowerment of women and legal equality. Second wave feminism came along in the mid-20th century, And one of its more famous proponents was Simone de Beauvoir, the girlfriend of existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Simone is well known for her assertion, on ne naît pas femme, on la devient, which means we are not born women, we become one. She was denying that anything related to femininity was biological or present at birth. Now, back in the mid-20th century, that might have been a workable hypothesis, even if it sounded a bit fishy. But in the later 20th century, neuroscience research exploded. The 1990s were designated the decade of the brain by the NIH. And that research found that there are concrete, persistent, and pervasive differences between male and female cognition. Male children really are more aggressive, more systems-oriented, and more inclined toward risk-taking. Female children really are more empathetic, less aggressive, and risk-averse. The complete list is actually much longer. But these are averages. There's no dividing wall that reliably separates one from the other, and there's a lot of overlap. Probably the one area where there is the least overlap is sex drive, where the difference between men and women is pretty large and persistent. But far from being culturally determined, these differences begin in utero and are already firmly established at birth. Even in the developing embryo, circulating testosterone causes male and female brains to develop differently. Now, not in a way we can structurally see like on MRI, but in the way that they're wired. If you want a good read on this topic, I can recommend Why Gender Matters by Leonard Sachs, is now in a second edition. But this doesn't mean that de Beauvoir was totally wrong. It's not an either-or kind of thing. Some gender roles and behaviors, even how people dress, really are culturally influenced. Now, virtually all modern Bible scholars agree that Paul's extended riff on head coverings speaks to a social construct, not a moral concern. But this cuts both ways. You know, if in the older days women were pressured to act like women, now there's a lot of cultural pressure to make women act more like men. And how is that any different or better? In 2024, we can reasonably declare that the science on this score is settled. The January 2017 issue of the Journal of Neuroscience Research was completely devoted to articles reviewing the neuroscientific evidence of innate male-female differences. And in his introduction, journal editor Larry Cahill wrote, "The notion that sex matters fundamentally, powerfully, and pervasively for all of neuroscience, not just for reproduction, is an idea whose time indeed has come." Well, we might say that idea came thousands of years ago, but better late than never, huh? Now, is this common knowledge? Of course not. Most of the media and education establishment are still living in the 70s. So myth number 10 is pretty easy to knock off, so let's forge ahead. Number 9, our countdown, intercourse between consenting adults is harmless. So according to the prevailing sexual narrative, it's morally neutral, harmless, possibly even healthy. The only constraint is mutual consent. Now, this idea really took off in the 60s because of the pill and has become an unquestioned assumption, especially by so-called progressives and most of the entertainment industry. So in TV and movies, most romantic relationships end up in bed. Apart from a few exceptions like Fatal Attraction, when are there ever any negative consequences? Well, let's do a reality check, okay? Well, consequence number 1 should be pretty obvious. No matter what they say, contraception, even if used, is far from 100% successful. A lot of abortions are done by women who are on the pill. Occasionally, intercourse still results in God's intended outcome. Number 2, sexually transmitted diseases. In April of 2022, the CDC reported that 2020 was a record year for gonorrhea and syphilis. If you remember, that was in the middle of a COVID lockdown. Even the CDC recommends limiting the number of sexual partners. We'll make that 1 or 0, and STDs cease to be an issue. Number 3 are the emotional consequences. Now, there's a complex and unavoidable neurochemical response to sexual intercourse that impacts how one feels and how one behaves in the future. Intercourse results in a dopamine hit, which, as you know, activates the brain's reward centers. Whatever you do that releases dopamine, your brain wants to keep doing more of it. That's true for gambling, jumping out of airplanes, birding on the 18th hole, or having sex. Sex also stimulates the production of oxytocin, And this is known as the cuddle hormone and is part of God's design to facilitate emotional bonding between father and mother or mother and child. Now, vasopressin has a similar effect in men. The brain doesn't differentiate, okay, between a lifelong monogamous partnership and a one-night stand, at least initially. However, the brain is also highly malleable. It can change. It learns and adapts. So over enough time, the brain adapts to whatever lifestyle you pursue. Now, this can become problematic if someone later decides to enter a monogamous relationship after years of promiscuity. It's like trying to make a sudden course correction on an ocean liner. Joe McElhaney, in that book, Hooked, has compiled an excellent review of the neuroscience on this subject if you want to read up. And lastly, there are the social consequences. How about if one of the partners in this hypothetical relationship happens to be married to someone else? Well, obviously it's a problem. How about it? What if they're not married? What if they're just cohabitating or just going steady? You know, an awful lot of conflict can be connected to something that's supposed to be harmless. Moving on, as we continue, we come to myth number 8, marriage is just a piece of paper. Well, this works like an ace of spades for men in cohabiting relationships who want to justify not marrying their partner, but most women, on the other hand, are not so thrilled with this particular line. But suppose it's true. Are there really no differences, say, between married and cohabiting couples? Well, as you might suspect, the data shows otherwise. Here on the rise, a review from Linda Waite and Maggie Gallagher. It was written around the turn of the millennium, so it's over 20 years old, but the data has really held up and continues to strengthen. Linda Waite is a social science researcher who studied marriage over many decades. Even by this time, there was a wealth of data on the difference between cohabiting relationships and marriage. Couples who were married exhibited much higher levels of commitment to one another, both in their personal lives and specifically in the area of sex. They are more focused on the lives of their partners and more concerned with their partner's interest. Adults who are married, especially women, are safer, physically safer, and at lower risk of abuse or violent death. This even extends to death from illness. Men who are married can expect a significantly greater life expectancy. And of course, married couples were consistently more financially secure than cohabiting ones. On the other hand, cohabiting partners show much lower levels of commitment. The relationships are less stable and of shorter duration. Partners in a cohabiting relationship are less dependent upon the other person and less interested in their partner's life. In addition to all that, they're inherently more violent with greater risk of domestic abuse. Furthermore, if the couple does eventually marry, the chance of that marriage surviving more than a couple of years is significantly reduced. So it turns out that cohabitation is substantially inferior to marriage across a wide range of parameters. It's a whole lot more than a piece of paper. Now, throughout history, most people understood that. In position number 7, we have the sexual revolution was a boon for women. Well, how do they justify that? Well, the claim is that it enabled women to pursue rich lives and fulfilling careers without the burdens of domestic responsibility and early motherhood. Even better, women were free to have sex whenever and with whomever they choose, just like men. Now, there's little evidence that's really what women want, but I can't speak for them. Of course, to advance this argument, they must assume that financial and legal equality with men was part and parcel of the sexual revolution, but that's what we call an equivocation fallacy. There was never a moral argument against legal equality for women, and support for this principle was widespread across Western society. That was called first-wave feminism. The sexual revolution, as you recall, was second-wave feminism. That was not a natural progression, but a paradigm shift. But as a consequence of the sexual revolution, young women today are marrying older and less likely ever to become married. With the decreasing chances of marriage ever, there is a decreased chance of motherhood. Even just delaying the age of marriage leads to decreased fertility and reduced family size. Whereas women are doing much better now in terms like sports or business or college graduation rates, happiness has not come as part of the package. In fact, researchers have documented a decline in women's happiness. In 2009, the American Economic Journal published an article called "The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness." They documented that over a span of 35 years, women's happiness has declined both in absolute terms and relative to men throughout the industrialized world. So why'd they call it a paradox? Because everybody took it for granted that there was no downside to the sexual revolution and that happiness derived from money and power. Nevertheless, today's women are more likely to be depressed, more likely to experience anxiety, and less satisfied with their life situations. Let's actually visualize this in a couple of charts. In this graphic from the Institute for Family Studies, we can see that the percentage of 25 to 50-year-olds who have never been married, that's the dark blue, has risen from 9% in 1970 to a whopping 35% today. That's never been married. Number currently married in the green has dropped from nearly 90% to barely over 50%. Last month, as a matter of fact, the Institute for Family Studies reported that the share of American adults who have ever married is now at a historic low, and the data indicates that 1 out of 3 adults will never marry. What this chart also doesn't show is that there's a strong economic component to this as well. The percentage of high-income adults who've never married is in the low 20s, but the percentage of low-income adults who've never married is over 40%. And Mark Regnerus down at UT describes how this works. He said, while sex has become cheap, marriage is now very expensive. And when he says marriage is expensive, he's not talking about the flower bills. He's saying, in terms of expectations of society and potential partners, because women are marrying later and less likely ever to be married, they are having fewer children than they would like. You can see in this chart, based on data from the General Social Survey, that there's a significant gap between the number of children women say they want to have, that's in the top line, and the number of children they probably will have in the bottom line. In fact, the gap is presently the highest it's been in 40 years. But even at the beginning of this chart, the fertility rate in that bottom line was already low. If you can't read, that's a 2 across the bar there. So most women are having now less than 2 children. What this doesn't show is that there's actually a dramatic plunge in fertility from 1960 to 1975 after abortion and the pill became widely available. So for, I lost my place here. So for much of the last 40 years, birth rates have been below replacement levels. It wasn't just abortion and the pill. Along with the sexual revolution came declining marriage rates and a culturally sanctioned narcissism that encourages a perpetual adolescence, which is incompatible with parenthood. Now, people can believe whatever they want, but the reality is that having children is a pretty high priority for most women and often foundational to their long-term happiness. If you question that, talk to any woman who's had to deal with infertility. Now, not all women realize this, and it might not be true for all women, but in the midst of all this, there's one group of women who have bucked the trend and are much happier than the rest. Care to guess? That's right, married women with children. Brad Wilcox has a book coming out you may have heard of talking about this. So just based on this brief overview, we can see that the sexual revolution hasn't exactly been all wine and roses for women in Western society. But that's just half the story. Men aren't doing so great either, but that's another story for another day. Well, I'm not quite halfway through the list, but already some of these assumptions don't seem to be holding up that well. Let's move to number 6 in our countdown. Chastity and monogamy are oppressive. If you guess that this had shades of Sigmund Freud, you'd be guessing right. They say that when your only tool is a hammer, the whole world is a nail. For Sigmund Freud, sex was his hammer. He attributed all kinds of psychiatric disorders, real and imagined, to what he called repressed sexuality. As you probably know, although Freud had some good insights into the human subconscious, most of his work was really complete bunk. He didn't really do research so much as just make things up, and his theories have not held up well over the last 50 years. Okay, well, people don't read Freud, but they do watch TV and they go to movies. And inevitably, the narrative follows the same pattern. Characters who are committed to chastity or monogamy are repressed, judgmental, boring, and generally dysfunctional. Or they're hypocrites and closet libertines. Producers and writers love to pretend that sex is harmless and healthy, that the sex drive should never be suppressed. I think I've already given a few reasons why maybe it ought to be suppressed, and there are more on the way. But let's take that myth as a hypothesis and go with it. Okay, what are the alternatives to monogamy and chastity? Well, basically, you're left with free, unconstrained sex and the elimination of marriage. And it's not as if this hasn't been tried before. It was partially operational in imperial Rome, at least if you were a male member of the ruling class. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, radicals sought to abolish marriage and the nuclear family and set out to do exactly that. There was a resulting explosion in sexually transmitted diseases, abortion, and rape. The experiment was a disaster and was quickly brought to a halt, even by the communist revolutionaries. But when marriage and monogamy are really examined, they actually turn out pretty well. The research consistently shows that married people are happier, healthier, and even enjoy better sex lives. Social groups with a high percentage of married couples and intact nuclear families are more stable, with lower crime rates, higher employment, and greater prosperity. And the right hand of the screen is the cover of From Shame to Sin by Kyle Harper, a professor of classics at the University of Oklahoma. Harper described how things worked in first century Rome. Male aristocrats ruled the roost. Upper-class women had some property rights. Any women further down, which was most of them, had no rights, including the right not to be raped by their owners or another powerful male. Christianity didn't impose a patriarchy. It invaded the patriarchy and overturned it. So the only losers in this biblical arrangement are who? Male sexual predators. So let's go on and talk about sexual predators. Myth number 5, we're not responsible for sexual predators. Well, the activists don't deny that sexual predators exist. They simply argue that their ideology is not to blame. So how do they explain their existence? Well, I saw a documentary on the Harvey Weinstein scandal. It was pretty good up until the end. The filmmaker asked about solutions, and it seemed everybody's answer was to get more women producers in Hollywood. It was just a matter of unfair power distribution. Funny how that power thing keeps coming up. Well, I don't have any problem with having more female producers in Hollywood, but there still would be male producers, so you wouldn't really be eliminating the problem. And how does that help the 99% of victims who aren't wealthy, talented Hollywood starlets? How does it help the waitresses or the hotel maids? On top of that, their victims aren't always female. Anybody here hear of Kevin Spacey? Besides the issue of power, they bring up the matter of consent. Well, of course, consent's pretty important, but it's not exactly a Boolean quality, which means either 1 or 0. There are degrees of consent and situations in which it seems very ambiguous or contingent, or perhaps one or both partners is under the effect of mind-altering substances. And then, of course, there's that perennial villain, toxic masculinity. Well, they actually have a point there, but their error lies in equating toxic masculinity with traditional masculinity. And that's another what we call equivocation fallacy. Only a lunatic would imagine there's any connection between raping women and declining to ordain them. But let's keep this toxic masculinity thing on the table for a few minutes. So you all know about the Me Too movement. You've heard about the sex abuse scandals from the Boy Scouts and the Roman Catholic Church. The data shows that there was a spike in abuse cases during the 70s and 80s. Well, what's significant about the 70s and 80s? These were the decades immediately following the sexual revolution. Now, it's really not that complicated. If you want to know what causes sexual predators, you got to study the predators. Well, I've got good news for you. That's been done. In 1996, Neil Malamuth developed what he called the confluence model of sexual predator formation. He initially identified 2 elements in their development. The first was misogyny, a general contempt toward women. So yeah, toxic masculinity, if you want. It does exist, and it's nothing we need to be defensive about. Let's just be clear about what it is and what it isn't. Now, the second was what they call casual sexual orientation. Now, this has nothing to do with your preference of partner. Casual sexual orientation describes one's attitude towards sex itself, whether it is deep and meaningful and only within a loving, committed relationship, or whether it's trivial and something to be gratified whenever the opportunity arises. In other words, the exact opposite of a biblical position. Well, it turns out that both of these are strongly correlated with the formation of sexual predators. Now, the confluence model doesn't account for all cases. Another major factor in the development of sexual predators is a history of abuse as a child. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle by which abusers create new abusers. But there's a third pillar that took some time to identify. Yet in the last decade, research has conclusively demonstrated that pornography is another major contributor to the development of sexual predators, which takes us down to number 4 in our countdown. Pornography doesn't hurt anyone. Now, in the last few decades, pornography has become ubiquitous, and that's largely because of the internet. Conservatives have always opposed pornography because of the moral implications, and often we tried to pass or preserve legislation keeping it out of the marketplace. Unfortunately, this continued to be struck down by courts on the basis of First Amendment arguments. Now, intuitively, we figured out it really can't be that good for you, but it proved to be really hard, showing that there was a direct connection between pornography and sexual misconduct. This argument has been going on for a long time, but in last 10 years, the evidence for the danger of pornography has become very compelling. It might be that the early studies just didn't show that much of an impact because by current standards, it was really pretty tame. The Playboy of 50 years ago has very little connection to what the hardcore sort of stuff that is readily available today to your average 10-year-old with a smartphone. And I hope your kids don't have smartphones. Today, we know a lot more about pornography, and what we know is damning. I've already mentioned some of the neurobiology behind sex, and everything that I said about sex applies to pornography. You get the same dopamine effects, and that which generates dopamine can lead to addiction. There's a strong link between pornography consumption and male impotence. Like any other addiction, it often happens that higher and higher levels of stimulation are needed to achieve the same effect. Unfortunately, for some of these people, real human females eventually can't compete with the intensity of arousal they get from the pornography they consume. Now, clearly, this is going to have an impact on relationships, especially if the consumer of pornography is married or in a long-term partnership. Now, in this area of sexual economics, this is really the cheapest sex of all. If they can gratify their sex drive this way, men needn't expend the effort to court a woman. Some, in fact, just drop out of the marriage market altogether, making the odds even worse against women. Now, from the earliest days, the pornography industry was based upon the exploitation and abuse of vulnerable women. Often they were trafficked, yet today it's only gotten worse. And again, building upon the previous myth, it's now firmly established that pornography has a causal connection to the development of sexual predators. There's a large body of research showing that young people exposed to pornography have more lifetime sexual partners, mix alcohol and drugs with sex, engage in riskier sex, and are more likely to be sex offenders. On the right, you see a book and a website called Your Brain on Porn, where you can access a wealth of scientific data on this matter. Now, people are beginning to clue in. Here's a Saturday essay from the London Times by Louise Perry, a secular Brit who wrote a scathing indictment of the sexual revolution, also a great read. It's called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Here's a screenshot from the website yourbrainonporn.com. It looks like they have a lot of data here, but what you see here is really just the table of contents, all the dozens and dozens of links to other articles. So after several decades of research, we now know that pornography really is bad for you. You know, some of us knew that all along. So I said there's one that I would rank above all others. These aren't ranked in order, but to me, this is the biggest lie. The children will be fine. Well, if we wanted to be snarky, we could say that we could add the qualifier, those children who are allowed to be born, but we don't want to be snarky, do we? Throughout the decades following the sexual revolution, many of us expressed concern about the impacts upon children. The continued refrain was that children are resilient. In fact, they will be just fine. Well, they're not fine. Now, there are a lot of constituencies that really want this to be true. People who are divorcing or wanted to make divorce easier didn't really want to feel burdened with guilt over its effects on children. Another large category consisted of those who wanted to destigmatize unmarried childbearing. Of course, that's always a delicate situation. Well, you don't want to make matters worse with our rhetoric. Denying the evident harm serves no one. In 2021, Katie Faust and Stacy Manning came out with this outstanding piece of work called Them Before Us. Katie has a long history as a children's rights advocate. She also has a personal connection as her parents divorced and her mother subsequently entered a same-sex partnership. With the sexual revolution, everything is about gratifying the selfish desires and the fantasies of adults. Children are treated as commodities. Both divorce and extramarital pregnancy result in children who are deprived of one or the other parent. Now, sometimes that's tragic and unavoidable, but there's a sizable contingent of activists who see nothing wrong with this institution. But in so doing, they ignore a vast realm of research showing just how hurtful they are to children. Kids raised without a father are at an increased risk of dropping out of school, behavioral disorders, mental disorders, incarceration, poverty, physical and sexual abuse, early pregnancy, and almost every other possible measure of social pathology. Kids raised without a mother don't fare all that well either, but it's just a lot less common. But now, thanks to technology, we have an increasing population of kids who are conceived outside of sex by either sperm donation, egg donation, embryo donation, or surrogate pregnancy. This leads to a population of children who are permanently estranged from their genetic parents, and in the case of surrogacy, even their own birth mother. The data shows that the safest place in the world for any child is to be at home with his or her biological parents. Any departure from this in any direction raises the likelihood of physical and even sexual abuse. The most dangerous situation is when a child shares a household with an unrelated adult male. In one series, the risk of abuse was actually 50 times greater. But both divorce and extramarital pregnancy lead to deprivation of either a mother or a father. Katie Faust makes an excellent point in the book. She objects to the use of the word parenting because it really consists of two separate and irreplaceable components, mothering and fathering, and kids need both. They're not the same, they're different. But it gets worse. In same-sex partnerships, that's not a bug, it's a feature. And I would gather most of you have had mothers and fathers, although you may not have known them or lived with them throughout your upbringing. But if you were lucky enough to grow up with both parents, which one would you have given up for a duplicate of the other? Would you have given up your father for a second mother? Would you give up your mother for a second father? Do you seriously believe they're interchangeable? But people really do believe this, but it's really despite all the evidence and the universal sum of human experience. Remember I said earlier men aren't doing all that great either? Well, this is where it starts. Half of all children are male, and this is where the problems begin. The children are not fine, and the sexual revolution is to blame. Down to the last two, there is no meaningful difference between homosexuality and heterosexuality. Now, this is a really sensitive subject, and for better or worse, LGBTQ issues have consumed most of the oxygen for the last 30 years. Well, what do I mean here? I mean the narrative that they're socially, biologically, and morally equivalent, like height or hair color, or right-handed versus left-handed, even something to celebrate, like here. Now, it's hard to know how many people seriously believe this, probably a lot. I think it's fair to say that it's a foundational assumption in Western pop culture. Now, considering that homosexuals are consistently portrayed as helpless and powerless victims, and they have at times really been badly treated, there's a lot of sympathy to this viewpoint. Some people really want it to be true. So I'm going to pass on the moral judgments. What are the basic differences from a social, a medical, or a biological standpoint? To be clear, even though we lump them in the same category, there are big differences between male and female homosexuality in the psychology, in the stability and ability to change over time, and in the sexual practices. So mostly I'm just going to talk about male homosexuality. Point number one, it's pretty obvious that male homosexuals do not engage in what could be considered healthy physiologic sexual intercourse. The alternative pursued by most is extremely dangerous from a medical standpoint. The rectal wall is much thinner and less elastic, lacks the immune defenses of a woman's vagina, harbors dangerous pathogens, and ends in a sphincter, which is essential to proper functioning, but an impediment to misuse. This is one reason why a 2021 report from New Zealand published in the British Medical Journal found that relative to heterosexuals, gay and bisexual men faced a 57-fold increased risk of gonorrhea, a 163-fold increased risk of syphilis, and a 348-fold increased risk of HIV/AIDS. But another contributing factor to the much higher rate of sexually transmitted diseases is that gay men have more partners than their heterosexual counterparts. This chart illustrates survey findings from the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. In the top row, we see that having more than 20 lifetime partners is over 3 times more common among homosexual men. They're in the green. In the bottom row, an overwhelming majority of heterosexual men report fewer than 10 lifetime partners. This drops to only 30% of gay men. In fact, this would be predicted according to the theories of sexual economics advanced by Roy Baumeister and Mark Regnerus. While in heterosexual encounters, females act as the gatekeepers. In male-to-male relationships, that gatekeeper effect is eliminated. There's also a strong cultural component here. During the AIDS epidemic, levels of promiscuity dropped precipitously, but in recent decades, it has rebounded within the gay population, according to a 2019 paper from the CDC. Another obvious difference is that same-sex relationships are obviously incapable of bringing new little humans into existence. Yeah, there are workarounds, like I mentioned, but this is done for the benefit of the adults, certainly not the children. No child should be brought into this world purposely knowing that that child won't have either a mother or a father, but it's happening through artificial insemination or surrogacy. Katie Foss discussed this at length and has collected many heartbreaking stories of kids raised in these situations. It's also well known that within the gay population, both male and female, there are much higher rates of depression, drug addiction, abuse, and suicide. Now, the simplest explanation for me as a physician would be that it's just a naturally unhealthy state, and these mental illnesses are what we would call comorbidities, diseases that kind of go with the picture. But there's a different hypothesis that blames society and those who don't accept homosexuality. They blame society for the mental illness. This is called the minority stress theory, and of course it's popular among those who want to deny any basic difference between heterosexuality and homosexuality. Now, it's certainly possible that discrimination is a factor, but there's no way it can explain all the differences, and that goes against really what is one of the most consistent principles of human psychology, that nothing ever reduces to one simple cause. Now, more than one researcher has pointed out that male homosexuals on average exhibit much higher levels of neuroticism as a core trait, and this may mean that they're just more likely to interpret routine encounters as discrimination or abuse, leading to elevated reporting in these surveys. So why does all this matter? Because those who refuse to admit any basic difference are forced to come up with explanations for why all these differences exist, when the differences are really quite obvious. But let's go ahead and move on to our final myth. That's just the way God made me. Well, that's really more of a theological statement than a scientific one. The implied claim here is that if you can somehow attribute your behavior to something inborn rather than a matter of will, then you shouldn't be held morally accountable. Of course, to get there, you have to dismiss 2,000 years of Christian teaching that we're all born with a sin nature and yet still morally accountable. So that really doesn't cut it. I think it's been pretty convincingly settled that science can't define morality. This goes back to David Hume 300 years ago, who concluded that you can never derive an ought from an is. Science can describe how things are, but science cannot say how things ought to be. For guidance on theology and morality, I direct everyone to the reference on the screen, on the right of the screen. Of course, in the field of medicine, we know that we're born with all sorts of things that are bad for us. Well, probably over 50% of illness among American adults is directly related to lifestyle and fully preventable. That still leaves a lot of disease. So Tay-Sachs disease is a genetic disorder common among Ashkenazi Jews that attacks the central nervous system. Children born with the infantile form almost never live more than 5 years, but they're also born that way. Now, you could object that Tay-Sachs disease doesn't have any moral or behavioral connotations, and you'd be right. There's a fairly long list, though, of behavioral disorders with a strong genetic component, including ADHD, Tourette syndrome, addictions, and schizophrenia. No human behavior or personality trait is exclusively linked to a genetic cause. Everything represents a mixture of nature and nurture, but this principle also applies to the area of human sexuality. Since this line, "I'm born that way," is often used by those seeking the normalization and acceptance of homosexuality, what does the science have to say? Are they really born that way? No, probably not. Now, the official positions of both the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association is that the causes of same-sex attraction are unknown, but probably multifactorial, meaning many things leading up to it. Based on twin studies and genetic surveys, we can say with confidence that there's no such thing as a gay gene, and genetics probably plays a small role at most. Like most human traits, same-sex attraction seems to be a combination of nature and nurture, a combination of how you're born and how you're influenced by your family, your society, your culture. We do know, for instance, that it's slightly more common among identical twins, but in the vast majority of twin pairs, if one is identical twin pairs, if one is gay, most of the time the other is not. There's also a little birth order effect, and that younger male siblings are at increased risk over older ones. Now, as I dove into this issue, I found that things were really much more complex than most people realize. All evidence indicates that homosexuality, as we now know it, is actually a recent social construct. So think back to Simone de Beauvoir saying femininity is all socially constructed. Well, that's not true, but it turns out there's a lot of evidence that homosexuality, as we see it today, has been socially constructed. By recent, I mean beginning in the early 18th century. There wasn't even a word for it until around 1850. Now, homosexuality, as we understand it, incorporates a number of elements, both gender nonconformity, that means like tomboys and among women and sort of feminine or sissies among boys. Both of these are common, and also same-sex attraction is common, and we can study these and quantify them. But this nebulous thing called homosexuality, as we understand it today, is more than just those things. It's an identity, and that identity can be chosen or rejected. We know this because there's a real population of same-sex attracted men and women who reject that identity. And psychologically and socially, they do as well or better than the ones who choose to embrace that identity. Now, transgenderism is a whole another story. Up until 2013, a person who believed that they belonged to the other sex was diagnosed as having something called gender identity disorder. Now, this diagnosis disappeared in the DSM-5, which is the psychological reference, but it wasn't because of any scientific breakthrough. It was an accommodation to the political environment. That's not science. It's metaphysics, and it's really bad metaphysics. It's scientifically and logically incoherent for a biological male to claim he's a woman, or vice versa. This is because the effects of the sex hormones during fetal development and the early postnatal period. Like I mentioned, a young boy, even if puberty is blocked, is already 2/3 of the way to middle manhood and can never go back. Remember those male-female differences I talked about? I only mentioned a handful out of dozens. Most of these present in early childhood, even infancy. Puberty is not required. But neurobiology doesn't eliminate the possibility of human choice. Even on people who are committed secularists, few are willing to go that far. We still have the ability to make choices. Because the brain is very dynamic and adaptable, we have some control over what direction it travels. Golf instructors love the saying that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. Anybody hear that before? Well, that's quite true of the brain, actually. Every time you indulge in particular thoughts or behaviors, you're forming connections. keep doing it, and those connections grow stronger. Practice makes permanent, but the reverse is also true. That's probably why the Bible has so much to say about keeping our minds pure and focused on righteousness. You know, Paul didn't know neurobiology, but God invented it. So let's land this plane. Here's my thesis. When it comes to sexuality, it is not Christianity that is in conflict with mainstream science. It's a prevailing cultural narrative. Now, these issues are complex. I don't claim that you can take this and defeat anybody in debate. You know, those who are opposed to morality, Christian morality, can cherry pick data to support their own preferred narrative. And there's no way you can anticipate every objection they might raise. Now, there's a ton of evidence showing that all of us are routinely led astray by cognitive biases, misinformation, disinformation, and intellectual pride. That's going to be our talk tomorrow morning. You know, people believe all sorts of errors because they want to. You know, how do we know I'm not succumbing? Let me give you 5 good reasons why we're not. Number 1, you can look who is on our side. All major world faiths, even a lot of atheists, all races, and many political persuasions. This isn't just some quirk of white fundamentalist Christianity. Number 2, you can look at who's not on our side. Highly motivated players with transparent personal agendas. So don't forget Huxley or Harvey Weinstein. Number 3, common sense. We all see the wreckage around us. How many of your friends and family have been impacted by this? Maybe all of them? Number 4, our position doesn't depend on postulating any conspiracies, assuming motives, or invisible actors. It doesn't depend on cherry-picking the evidence or taking quotes out of context. Everything I have shown tonight is really undisputed within the scientific community. Number 5, almost all cognitive biases are self-serving. Nothing is more self-serving than the notion that you can have sex anytime you want with anybody who will. The Christian sexual ethic runs against self-serving biases. So, in summary, all available evidence leads to one inescapable conclusion. The optimal paradigm for human flourishing, mental and physical health, and societal well-being is lifelong heterosexual monogamy. So it turns out after 60 years of a failed social experiment, the Bible was right all along. Thank you. Didn't do too bad.
Thank you, Dr. Willing. I very much appreciate that presentation. And I know that he had offered to answer some questions if we have time. It's just a little before 8. Are you still okay with that?
Sure.
So if anybody has any questions related to the presentation or maybe even just modern day sexual apologetics, Dr. Willing would be willing to answer those.
Just to crack the ice here. So someone watching the presentation might hear a lot of the bad things associated with sex, a lot of consequences, a lot of bad outcomes and so forth. You might talk a little bit about the health benefits of sex in a healthy marriage. What sort of scientific evidence is there to support that?
I didn't really, mostly the point of this is to defend Christian sexual morality against the secular options. I think partly it's reflected in the fact that you saw much higher levels of happiness among married people. I didn't even say the whole picture. It's not just, when I talked about the effects upon women, I said which women are the happiest, and married women with children, which also happens to be married women who are religiously committed and politically conservative. So it's even more that, and you say more levels of happiness. So it's that partly, and there are other studies that show generally people who engage in sex are happier. But it's certainly something that God has provided for the blessing of all. Did you have something more specific in mind?
No, just, that was good.
Yeah.
So what, as a mom, are there
Apologetics. I mean, John and I have been talking about it a lot this evening. Apologetics is spiritual warfare. And how do I get there? Well, Ephesians 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And it talks about our weapons. And, what are the weapons? Apologetics. In a short word, it's using rational arguments and facts and evidence to support the Christian view. There are different forms of apologetics, but it's making arguments for defense of the Bible, for defense of Christian teaching, without using the Bible, because if you use the Bible to prove the Bible, you're arguing in a circle. So how we get out of going in a circle is by looking at other sources of evidence. There's a famous confession, the Belgic Confession, that God makes himself known through special revelation, which is the Word of God, but he also expresses himself through general revelation. It's called the two books view. He expresses himself through revelation and nature. Now, the confessions technically is specifically talking about God revealing himself, but it infers on that how do we know truth? Now, again, that's much of the talk tomorrow morning is how do we know truth? But we can get truth through revelation, or we can gain truth through studying of the natural world. And if we studied it honestly, then we shouldn't be led astray that God can never contradict himself. He can never deceive. He can never lie. R.C. Sproul, I'm going to have to get back to the original question after I go in this little digression. But R.C. Sproul, passed away a few years ago, but he used to tell this story. He said he had a seminary class once, and he had these young seminarians and said, how many of you believe that God's revelation in Scripture is infallible? And they all wave their hand and say, how many of you believe that God's revelation in nature is infallible? And they were all kind of hesitant. He says, it's the same God. God reveals himself, and he reveals truth and communicates truth through the study of nature as well as through the study of Scripture. And you can't separate them out. How do we get the Bible? We get it through years of copying. We get it through translation. We get it through archaeology. We are dependent upon humans and natural processes even to get the Bible to us. Now, certainly the Holy Spirit was maybe involved in making sure that these things happen, but it was through humans that we even get the Bible. Approximately, maybe not ultimately. So back to the apologetics and how you address it. Yeah, like I said, there are resources. We're talking because I don't know of a single book where you could do all that or defend all sexuality. I think that's a major failure in the Christian community that it doesn't exist. I have a lot of resources on my website. My name is Steve Willing, and my website is swilling.com, including this talk. I developed an 8-part curriculum that I've given at my church in Alabama and another church we attend in Colorado. And I've given individual talks to various chapters by Zoom and such. I can certainly point you some resources that I enthusiastically recommend. One is the Colson Center, came out of Chuck Colson's ministry, John Stone Street, Breakpoint. I think everybody should be getting that Breakpoint message every day. Take you 1 minute to read, maybe 2 if you're a slow reader. It's in that because I get so many of the things that I've come across. The first place I even knew about it was getting it through Stone Street. Now, what I can do, somebody like me, I can parse through that because you would have to go through, like 10 years of reading all his daily things to get all this stuff because he talks about a lot of other things as well. But he does do a lot of the sexuality stuff, and they're very digestible blurbs. Another good resource is the Christian Medical and Dental Association. We have cmda.org. We have a blog. I have a couple of blogs, but I contribute to that as well. The blog where you can find resources on that is called The Point. That's the name of the blog on the CMDA website. A longtime contributor to that is Andre Van Mol, who's a family physician, I think from Oregon. No, he's from California. Andre Van Mol, who's been active in a lot of the providing testimony to legislatures and court cases and stuff. Beyond that, I'm trying to think who else. You know, I'm trying to, I'm not setting myself up as the authority. I'm setting myself up more as the person who can take all this information and kind of parse it down into something that can be communicated, because to really get up to speed, right now, as things stand, you need to read about 3 dozen books and about 200 scientific articles, and nobody's going to do that. But there are resources, but I'm just trying to get a fire lit, and hopefully there are a few other people out there who are doing the work as well, because I sure can't do it myself, not in my own power.
So to repeat, cnda.org.
And breakpoint.org. Does anybody here get the Breakpoint commentary? So you nodded your head, at least one person. I think everybody should be getting it.
And also your blog, swilling.com.
swilling.com.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Willing? Yes, Laura.
So a lot of times when people are arguing, you'll have secular people say that the science doesn't support. So how do you answer that in terms of like, how do we as Christians then tell them or inform them like that article you're referring is not, I mean, like without reading it, how do we know? We're not going to know, or how can we offer a counter to that when they say, well, this random article from 2021 by this random person says this? Like, is there a way to combat that? Because that, like, it seems like if you're not a subject matter expert, or if well, you're not reading the science, you're only, reading the Bible. Like, that seems to be a common argument, like that we're not literate, like we're not capable of critical thinking. So how can we respond? Is there a way to respond, or do we just let them roll in their ignorance?
Pray for them and use the weapons of spiritual warfare. There's, it rarely goes anywhere to try and debate a committed ideologue. You cannot reason a person out of a belief that they were not reasoned into to the beginning. And somebody who doesn't want to believe, if their will is to not believe, nothing is going to shake that. So you may just be wasting your time arguing. Enjoy the peace that passeth all understanding by having the Spirit of God, and just being grateful that hopefully your life is better because you're living by these principles, and realize that if they're not living by these principles, all the data indicates that they're probably deep down miserable and unhappy inside, unless they're a sexual predator. But I think, say the creation evolution thing, which I don't really want to get into, or the old age, young age. Yeah, I see fierce arguments, over these by people who are total non-scientists, and sometimes the level of the argument is just depressing. It's so sad. If somebody's, so you don't want to get, if you're not a medical person or scientist, if you're a layperson, you don't want to get involved with a layperson. Let the scientist argue the scientist, but you could certainly point to a few sources that say, you point them to my website and say, here's the data. It's not, if they don't want to have their mind changed, it's not going to change their mind. Like I say, I'm not primarily doing this so you can argue with atheists or sexual libertines. I'm primarily do this to strengthen the church and for your young people, so that they know, and to protect them from all the harm that will come from succumbing to these lies. Like I mentioned, did I already mention R.C. Sproul saying the primary? No, I didn't. I mentioned R.C. Sproul once. He had an article a couple years before he died in the Table Talk magazine. He talked about the central rules of apologetics. He said, first rule, for one purpose of apologetics is to tear down the cultural idols of the day. The second purpose of the apologetics is to provide an answer for our position, but he said the third and most important rule of apologetics is for the building up of the church, for the strengthening of the saints. And so I'm providing this material not for debating somebody, but to secure the faith of those who are within the church but maybe wavering. And the data shows that overwhelming majority of our young people are wavering. Because they're not being taught apologetics, they're not being told why, they're not being able to prepare to defend, and they spend, maybe 1, maybe 2 hours a week in church, and they spend the other 166 hours of the week on social media and TV and YouTube, and they're being flooded with messages, and that 98% of messages from the outside completely overwhelms the 2% message they're getting right here. Maybe the lady who raised her hand that she subscribed to Breakpoint could tell everybody how wonderful it is so more people will sign up.
Anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? All right. Well, Dr. Willing, thank you once again. Let's give him another round of applause, please. And remember, 10 a.m. tomorrow on UT's campus, Campus for Christ, right? Longhorns for Christ. I'll get it one of these days. There you go. You got a few Longhorns back there. Dr. Willing will be there tomorrow. John, did you want to say anything in closing? Or? John said if you want to come talk to Dr. Willing personally, he'd be available to stick around a little bit. But I don't think we would be doing God honor if we didn't close this time with prayer. So thank you once again, and let's go ahead and bow for a word of prayer as we close tonight. Father, we just thank you for this time. We've been able to come and hear this presentation, and more than just words on a screen or on a computer or even out of the mouth of one of your vessels. I pray, God, that our hearts and our minds would just be in tune with what it is that you have for us, that we would be in connection with the Spirit, and that, Father, your word would not just proceed into our heart, but it would proceed into action as we go out into this world and try to fight these battles. We know that ultimately our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against other principalities and powers, but man, it sure seems like it sometimes, that we're just all at war with each other, and we all have combating ideologies and beliefs and faiths. And God, I pray that sometimes when it comes down to it, we would just look at logic and reasoning, and that we would look at the natural order of things and realize that statistics and facts don't lie. And I pray, God, that as we do live at our faith, that we would use examples such as these and evidences such as these in order to help people understand maybe a foolishness of an argument, or maybe just that they weren't well equipped with the information. But ultimately, God, I pray we would conduct ourselves with love and generosity and kindness as we have these tough conversations. And we do appreciate people like Dr. Willing who are able to go around and share this message and to share these statistics to help inform people. Thank you for John Murphy, as well as the work that he does as president of Reasons to Believe down there in Austin. And God, I just pray blessings over their ministries and their families. And as we go out tonight, Father, I pray you keep us safe and bring us back safe next time we come. We ask all these things in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. All right. Thank you once again, Dr. Willing. You guys are dismissed unless you want to come ask